All right. So first of all, I'd like to thank the American Society of Mammalogists and the Grinnell Award Committee in particular, and a whole series of colleagues and former students who blindsided me with this award. It's certainly a major honor, and I do appreciate it. Also, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the survey that I did this last semester, and I'd like to thank all the respondents to that. Some of you I know are here. Also, a quick acknowledgement to the MVZ archives and the Bancroft Library at the University of California, Berkeley for some of the images that I'm going to be using. And lastly, I'd like to thank my wife and my family for 40 years of mammal craziness that I've had. So in the next 3 years, we're going to hear a lot about the history of the American Society of Mammalogists because of our centennial that's coming up in 2019. The group that you see here that was part of the original Bureau of Biological Survey certainly had a lot to do with the beginning of the American Society of Mammalogists. But what a lot of people don't realize is that C. Hart Merriam, who's the second from the left here, and Vernon Bailey on the far left, even though their contributions to mammalogy and ultimately the ASM were great, they weren't part of the academic tradition of teaching mammalogy courses. And that fell primarily to this person. Most of you have seen this picture before, Joseph Grinnell, for who the award is named. This is a picture taken in 1930 in his office at the MVZ prior to their move to the Life Sciences building. And it's this very professorial looking person in the book-lined office. But my favorite picture of Grinnell is this one. And the reason is that it shows Grinnell in the field. And for those of you who don't know, Grinnell considered himself a naturalist, and he published in his life 554 papers. But of those 554, only 76 were on mammals. So he was primarily, or he considered himself a naturalist, but he dealt with, most of his publications were in ornithology. But I think it's especially fitting that there's not very many pictures of him in the field, and the one that we have shows him preparing a specimen, and you'll notice that is not a bird, it's a chipmunk, and so I thought that was particularly fitting. The other picture I found in the archives was this one, and many of you can relate to a picture like this. This was on an expedition that they did to Pilot Knob, California. And they've obviously been in the field for a while. And for those of us who have spent some time in the field and done field work, we can recognize the look, I guess, so I went back to a few of my pictures, and one stood out, and it was this one. And that was in 1979. It was the field expedition to Mexico, which went full 2 months, and my two colleagues and I spent 2 months in Mexico collecting as graduate students, and we were all at Texas A&M University at the time. On the left is Mark Engstrom, who's now curator of mammals at the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto. In the middle is Duke Rogers, who many of you recognize from Brigham Young University, and I'm on the right. We all look a little worse for wear. This is at the very end of the trip. We'd all had a series of maladies that go along with doing field work. I'd had typhoid fever in the interim, but there's something about these this kind of introduction to field work in our careers that set the path for many of us. So. Many of you realize that Joseph Grinnell is considered the beginning of most of academic mammalogy because what he did at Berkeley was train students who then went out to other universities, and they trained other students who went out to other universities. And we talk about this as the academic genealogy. This is from 75 years of mammalogy. volume published in 1994. But for example, Grinnell trained E.R. Hall, who went to the University of Kansas, and then trained a whole array of biologists that went to other programs and started their own. So most of you in the audience can trace your lineage, essentially academic lineage, back to Joseph Grinnell. What I want to really talk to you about, and one of the questions that I was trying to address, is the history of mammalogy courses. And I was really surprised when I started looking into the literature to come across this book, which was published in 1845. It's called Elements of Mammalogy Prepared for the Use of Schools and Colleges. And what that implies is in the middle 1800s, at least, mammalogy was being considered in college classrooms, perhaps not as a course per se, but as part of a curriculum. This series also had one in ornithology and herpetology as well. But coming back to Grinnell, what I thought is perhaps Grinnell was the one that really got mammalogy courses started. But in looking through the literature, I could find no evidence that he taught a mammalogy course. Instead, he taught a course called Natural History of the Vertebrates. And in talking to the archivist at MVZ, she pointed out one of the interesting things about this is that this course, although the number has changed, is still being taught at Berkeley today. And she said it was the longest running course at the University of California, Berkeley. So that goes all the way back to Joseph Grinnell. One anecdote, he was obviously a well-loved professor, generated many, many students, but he was most comfortable in the field. And one of the ways that he got students involved, he had a project for this class in which he challenged the students to come up with an animal and write a report on it. So that does not too surprising, but there was a catch. The catch was that you couldn't use, as a student, you couldn't use any of the published literature to do the report. What you had to do is go to the field, observe the animal, write field notes, and use those field notes to produce the report, which I thought was a pretty innovative teaching methodology, even as far back as then. The other thing the archivist pointed out to me is recently the archives received from the Grinnell family a set of Grinnell's actual notes for his courses. And I just found this out last week, and so I asked if they could send me the titles of those, and there was one called The Last Lecture. And it was for this course, Zoology 113. And the notes were incomplete, but I found this that I thought I'd share with you, which is pretty interesting. It says, this was in a series of things that he thought were important for the students to know at the end of the course. And so number 5, it says, a plea for scientific natural history as a proper part of teaching in college or high school biology. Just as valuable a drill in pure science or drill with any other group of materials, indoors or outdoors, if seriously handled. And then he added 6, observation, disciplined, recorded systematically, a worthy scientific method. What he was trying to get across is that even in, these notes were written in 1931, even at that time there was this viewpoint of natural history as not being equivalent to science in other disciplines, that is, in a scientific way. And his viewpoint was that natural history and what we do in the field in terms of taking detailed field notes, tying those back to voucher specimens, is in fact a major part of science, and that it deserves its place, its recognition for that. So, by the way, David Schmidley, a few years back for his Grinnell presentation, addressed that very issue about natural history in his talk, what it means to be a naturalist and natural history at American universities. So, the next question I wanted to ask was when mammalogy courses really got started in earnest, and I figured a measure of that would be mammalogy textbooks. And so many of you recognize these, but the first modern textbook in mammalogy was in 1962 by Cockram, that one on the upper left, Introduction to Mammalogy. But what was surprising to me was within 2 years, another one was published, Davis and Golly, Principles in Mammalogy, and then 1965, Mammalogy by Vaughan was produced. So within 4 years, there was 3 textbooks in mammalogy, which should be an indication that mammalogy courses were starting to be widely taught. So probably the first half of the 20th century, there were a few courses, but by the 60s, things were rolling. Harvey Gunderson wrote a mammalogy text 10 years later in the 70s. And then the 2 texts that are still being widely used today, Vaughan's is still, Vaughan and colleagues is still being published. It's now in its 6th edition. And Feldhammer, a relative newcomer, in 1999 published their mammalogy textbook, and it's now in its 4th edition. So what I was trying to do with this project was address a couple of issues. One is how mammalogy is currently taught, and determine if changes have occurred in how we teach mammalogy in the last few decades. So the methodology I established was to come up with a survey, and I was naive in many respects. I've never done that kind of research before, and so I did had some errors in how I designed things, but I think it achieved my purpose. So I distributed it middle of March through the first week of June. How I distributed it was through 2 listservs, Mammalogy and NHCall. And then the Texas Society of Mammalogists had an emailing list, which I made use of. And then there were selected mammalogists that I sent it out to that I thought might have slipped between the cracks. So real quickly go through some of the information on the respondents. So we ended up with 268 total respondents, which I thought was reasonably good. The age categories were everywhere from over 65 to under 25, with a pretty normal or expected distribution of the age. Gender was skewed towards males, 59 to 41. I asked how many years have you taught mammalogy, and so for less than 10 years, and by the way, the survey was for people who have taken a mammalogy course or who have taught mammalogy courses. So some of the questions I'm going to be addressing were for the entire pool, others were just for the professors. So in this one, the professors who had taught mammalogy, and 142 responded, 58% were less than 10 years, but we had 8% that had taught mammalogy for over 30 years. What best describes your situation? So as expected, 35% or so were faculty, 21 or so graduate students. Had the rest of those categories, undergraduates, museum personnel, government, private industry, and retired. I forgot postdocs, so there was the other category is either mostly postdocs or a few that were bridged a couple of the categories. My hope was to make this an international survey, and so I sent this out in the hopes that I would get a lot of international response as well as those in the United States. And as you can see here, I had 268 total responses, 233 from the US. So there's somewhere 20 to 30 that were international. Most of those were Canada and Mexico, and I had a smattering of 1 or 2 from about 9 other countries, but not a very broad international response. But for 233 in the United States, I was pleased. We had 42 states represented, 3 of which had 5% or more: California, Indiana, Michigan, and then the anomaly there is Texas. And I obviously skewed that by sending it out to the Texas Society of Mammalogists, many of who knew me as a colleague and had students who had known me perhaps. So that is certainly a bias in this. I also asked the decade in which the respondents took mammalogy, and if you divide that pie chart in half, the left is essentially half of the respondents were from 2000 till the present, and the other half from before the year 2000. And then lastly, I wanted to figure out a little bit about what kind of universities are still teaching mammalogy, and I was pleased. yes, almost 50% were large universities over 20,000, but we had 17% that were from universities had 5,000 or less. So mammalogy as a course is being taught at all sizes of universities still, which is encouraging. Class sizes, I was curious about this, and as you can see, between 11 and 25 was the highest with 45%, many that were above that, up to 50. But there was quite a few, over 10%, that were over 50 in number, and I had 2 responses that were class sizes over 100, so which is surprising. So the survey included 4 general areas: field activities and labs, what's changed in teaching mammalogy, some innovative approaches to teaching, and then what are the impacts of the course on students. So let's start with the field component part. And so this was for the entire pool, and over 200 respondents. I said, when you took mammalogy, which of these activities were included? So the top 2 here, preparation of study skins in the lab and live trapping, were included in 3/4 of when all of you took mammalogy courses. Maintaining field notes and overnight field activities and observations of mammals were in the 60s, 60% range, and then salvage of roadkills and kill trapping were down in the 40s, misnetting of bats in the 40s as well. So, so now the next few are just for professors that teach mammalogy courses. So I asked, does the lab that you teach include field activities outside the classroom? And I was pleased that 85% of mammalogy courses include a field component based on the survey. 15% or thereabouts don't. The next question was, so what are the field activities that you currently use? And again, live trapping was up there around 84%. Observations of mammals and written field notes and overnight field activities still above 50% including those. And then the rest, misnetting of bats and trips to the zoos and museum specimen preparation. I've got an asterisk there by preparation of museum specimens, and the reason is that's probably a low figure because the way I asked the question was preparation of museum specimens in the field. And so on the other category, several mentioned, well, we don't do it in the field, but we have lab preparation of mammal specimens in the lab proper. Kill trapping was down around 28% for field activities. On the other question, there are other activities. I had failed to put camera trapping on there, and many courses are now incorporating camera traps into their labs. Track plates and identification of tracks, acoustical surveys of bats, trip to a museum. I had put trip to zoo, but in many metropolitan areas you can make a trip to the museum and take them to a mammal collection. And the last one was kind of interesting. Some included a preparation of a large mammal from a zoo or as part of the field or lab activity. So have any of these field activities been part of the course in the past or have been discontinued? So one of the things I was curious about is, have these things changed? And as you might expect, the top 2 here, kill trapping was, of those respondents, again 62 respondents on this, 54% had dropped kill trapping, preparation specimens in the field 46, live trapping had been dropped in 37% and on down. Others included overnight field activities, including misnetting, had been dropped from some, and preparation of study skins in the lab had been dropped by some. So the obvious question is, if in fact these are changing, if we're losing some of these field activities, what's the cause? And so I came up with this list that I provided in the survey, and in no real order: disease risk, hazards other than disease, expense, university policy, lack of interest, time commitment, IACUC, liability, and other. If you want to take a guess, number 1, these were ranked, so they could list as many as they want and then put first, second, third, fourth. Number 1 ranked was IACUC regulations. Number 2 was time commitment, and yes, it does take time to plan these activities and put it all together and get out to the field. Number 3 was liability issues. Number 4 was a tie between disease risk and university policy. But the truth is all of those were clustered together. None of them were significantly different than each other. So, which brings me to the other category. People had an open-ended answer, and what many put was all of the above. So all of those things contribute toward the reason that they were dropping field activities. Others mentioned were state permit problems, class size is too large, and I'll be the first to admit if it's a class of 100, you're not going to have very successful field excursions. Problems with getting vehicles. And then there was a few that had something having to do with humane treatment of animals, including this one that said kill trapping results in unnecessary death of non-target species. So concerns about that were part of the reason for this dropping of the field activities. So in what ways has the mammalogy course that so we're going to shift now from the field aspect to how things have been changed. And by the way, some of these categories, obviously there's some overlap among them, but how has mammalogy changed since you've been teaching it? And so this was an open-ended answer. So I had 94 responses on this. Some of the potential positive answers were more current literature and use of the web. So a lot of professors are involving use of the web and each year incorporating current literature into their course. Inquiry-based learning approaches. And then this last one, more emphasis on ecology and behavior, less on taxonomy. I saw that several that did that. I'm not necessarily sure that's a good one. That I think a taxonomy-based course is really important, but we also always get comments from students that they wish there was more ecology or behavior in addition to the taxonomy. So more frequently than those few were ones like this. What's changed as increased complexities due to IACUC and permit requirements, animal rights issues, hantavirus issues, less trapping, less handling of animals. And then I had some which I considered a little disconcerting, things like this. Students are less hungry for knowledge. They're less comfortable being challenged. Students use cell phones for photos of lab specimens and study those without handling the specimens themselves. And then a whole series that were along the lines of this, that a lack of interest by students in handling animals, specimen preparation, they don't like camping, they don't want to get outdoors, they don't have a curiosity about the natural world. And 10 years ago, Mark Hafner, the recipient of the Grinnell Award, did his presentation on that very issue. It was titled Field Research in Mammalogy and Enterprise in Peril. And it was published in the journal. If you haven't looked at that, it's an excellent treatise on this issue of especially when hantavirus entered the scene in classes. There was a concern about risks, and his talk pointed out that there's a lot of risks in life, and hantavirus may be one of those, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't be presenting these things to our students. So third on our list of general topics is innovation. So what ways to teach mammalogy that have you incorporated? And as you might expect, there's a lot of emphasis now on digital resources that are available. The Animal Diversity Web out of the University of Michigan is widely used. The Life of Mammal series has been used in many labs and lectures, and YouTube videos, of course. And I'll try this, just a quick example of what's amazing to me these days. Even 10 or 15 years ago, how could you imagine that within a few seconds you could pull up something like this to show to students? And what you're looking at, most of you have probably already seen, but this is West Texas, and those orange circles representation of airport radar that shows colonies of Tadera brasiliensis in West Texas radiating out from these source populations. So you've seen something like this, but what's interesting is that even for small colonies, that there's enough representation on the radar that you can pinpoint some of these smaller colonies, and as they disperse from the caves, they're being picked up on airport radar. So the idea that you could show students things like this is something that has changed remarkably in the last few years. All right, so moving on. The other thing that was mentioned by many is camera trapping, and many labs are now utilizing either checking out cameras for students to place in the field and monitor, or analyzing images from cameras that are out there. Many of you know about eMammal, which is a website that's maintained by the Smithsonian for citizen science and analysis of camera trapping data on many projects across the world, actually. Another one that I thought was especially interesting was this idea of an emphasis on valuable skills for mammalogists. And I tell my students that when they're finished with the course, I want them to feel like a mammalogist. This was an idea that incorporating into the lab, you introduce them to skills that mammalogists need. And so things like GPS and GIS and how to apply pit tags and acoustic monitoring and on down the list. But the one that surprised me that they added to this list were these last two, and applying for permits and filing IACUC protocols. And who would have thought that that would be considered a valuable skill for a mammalogist? And yet most of you in the audience realize that if you're planning on working in the field of mammalogy, these are skills that you have to deal with on a regular basis. A few real quick ones here. Some suggestions were having students make a 1 to 2 minute video and post that onto a class blog or a website. Students using phones to photograph lab specimens and sharing those to a website. Now, that was completely counter to the other one that looked at it as a negative, that by photographing, we've all seen students go along and just take pictures, and then they walk out of lab and use the photos. But maybe what you do is you encourage them to handle the skull and get different images of the skull so that they're actually doing both, and then posting that information up and sharing it among students is a valuable exercise. Curiosity project, someone suggested that you take advantage of the curiosity of the student that is curious about some aspect of mammalogy, and have them do the research to answer the question, and then put this in the form of whatever medium they wish. Maybe put together a short book or a video or a blog on that particular part of mammalogy. Scavenger hunts for zoos and museums, conducting an observation of local species like Grinnell's exercise. Conducting a forensics lab where you have owl pellets and maybe track plates, and you weave all those things into an exercise, into the track identification into the lab. And then later on, there's a problem with specimens in museums being used, or excuse me, specimens in labs. A lot of students complain that they don't look like the animal in life. And so someone pointed out what they do is they incorporate videos or live images of these things prior to the lab so that they can make the connection between the actual skins that they're seeing and the actual specimens, or the species. So this last part that I was trying to address was, do we have an impact on students? Do these courses have an impact? And so the first question I asked was, did any part of the course or activities have a negative impact on you at the time? And I was pleased to see 86+% said no, but we had 13% that said yes, there was a negative impact when they took this mammalogy. By the way, we're now back to students, the entire array, not just professors answering these questions. So of those that said it did have a negative impact, the obvious question is in what way? And as you might expect, killing mammals in preparation of study skins was at the top of the list. Live trapping was considered stressful to animals by some. Memorization of names and lab IDs don't go with the field that I just mentioned on specimens. Boring lectures, boring labs. One entry said that there was a good old boys club when they took mammalogy, and that the professor treated one group of the class differently than the rest, and it was along gender lines. Another said inbred lineages of mammalogists. I don't think they meant that literally, but I don't know. But what they're talking about was this Grinnell pattern that one university trains their students in a particular way and their students go out and train theirs in the same way. But what's nice about the ASM meetings is that you come and share ideas and get some gene flow, I guess. So did any part of the course or activities, the counterpart to that last question, have a positive impact on you? And again, close to 95%, which is encouraging. So the next question, in what way did it have a positive impact? And I had 185 answers, all open-ended, and I'm not going to show you those. But things like I'm now a mammalogist, it inspired me to work in the field. All of the things about the mammalogy course had a positive impact. It was an amazing, learned an amazing amount. Most influential course. So the last question I asked was, did taking a mammalogy course have an impact on your ultimate career choice? So does this translate to having an impact on what we do? And I was surprised, I guess 76+% said that yes, the mammalogy course did have an impact on their career choice. Now you wouldn't expect, some say, well, why is that low? Or 23% said no, but many of us came into this thinking that we wanted to work in mammals prior to taking our mammalogy course. So it's not too surprising that you had over 20% that said it did not have a direct impact. And then the very last question I had was, what do you most remember from your mammalogy course? And I had around 100 answers to this. Again, they're all open-ended, but how hard I had to work and how much I loved it. It was a really challenging course. I remember prepping specimens. I remember the museum specimens and the identification of skulls and skeletons. But this last one was kind of interesting. Camaraderie, fun interactions with students and faculty, fellowship, and I had quite a few that were along those lines. And there were a lot of other things that were listed that they remembered. But well over half put one thing, and that's field work. And what that tells me is that must be an important aspect of our courses. So you're in this picture. Well, if you're not in that one, maybe you're in this one, or that one, or maybe you're this one, or maybe in this one. Well, the reality is you're probably not in any of those, or at least some of you might be. But I'd be willing to bet that somewhere in your past, in your mammalogy class, that there's a class that a picture similar to this that you're in. And if you're teaching mammalogy, when you get students out in the field, it's something that they long will remember. So a few final thoughts on balance. So it's clear that the mammalogy courses we had impacted the vast majority of us, and I'm convinced that the courses we now teach have a similar impact, at least on some subset of those students. And there are lots of ways to improve your courses, and a considerable number have come about from the technology that's changed the way both students and professors see the world. But in this age of IACUCs and permit requirements and increased expenses and liability and university bureaucracy and all the rest, the question is a field component still important? Well, in my opinion, absolutely. So there's little doubt that many of the things that inspired us to pursue a career in mammalogy are still important in today's academic world. Exposing students to the hands-on world of mammals through an introduction to fieldwork is as important, in my opinion, in many ways as anything else you cover in the classroom. So let's end with Joseph Grinnell. I wonder what Joseph Grinnell would think about mammalogy today. Well, I'd like to think that Grinnell would be pleased with his legacy, and I'm certain he would be excited about where we are today. I also think he would agree that of course we should be advancing the field of mammalogy in the classroom to engage students with technological methods that improve their ability to learn, but there's no doubt in my mind that he would argue that there should be a balance in our approach to teaching mammalogy. Advances in classroom technology should not come at the expense of dropping something that goes back to our very roots as mammalogists, and that is getting students into the field. Thanks.
we do have time for some questions, so I'm sure Bob would entertain some.
So, I'm curious what you tell students when they ask you why they have to memorize a bunch of scientific names for bats and rats.
Well, that question came to me already in the meeting. Oh, sorry, the question, very good. The question is how do we address students who ask about why they have to memorize all these names? And my answer is that if you want to be in the field of mammalogy, and many of them that take the course do not, but if you want to be in the field of mammalogy and I say paramyscus to you and you don't have a clue what a paramyscus is, now, that being said, do you need to know every scientific name for every group? Probably not. And now the counter answer to that is that, well, I can look that stuff up in a flash. I can get that information, so why bother? And the problem is where do you draw the line with that? If you want to take that approach, why go to university at all? You can just Google everything in your whole life, and so that's not a very adequate answer, but I think that it's an important part of understanding mammals is to have part of the vocabulary to do that. Anybody else?
So we all have classes where there's the occasional student that maybe is a pre-med student but needed another elective and they figured mammals would be better than fish. So did you get any, but you probably didn't get any responses from those kinds of students. You probably got responses mostly from people who are in this discipline.
Okay.
So I'm wondering if you got any and what kind of comments they had.
So the question was, for the student part of the survey, how did I get responses from like pre-med students that were taking mammalogy, not because they had any interest truly in mammals, it was just another course. And I know that those students are out there. Yeah, I probably did not get those, and I couldn't discern who was answering the question, so that I didn't have a way to address that really. But my guess is that there's a lot of them, and I've had several that have gone on to be medical doctors and have come back to me and told me it was one of the greatest courses they had. So I think that they still can gain from that under the right circumstances. I think.
You know, it seems to me that sometimes people think of mammalogy as being natural history. Yet the biomedical field, if one looks at it directly, is in fact full of natural history. It's just that they're using wazoo techniques. So when you talk to your pre-meds, you can put that it's essentially natural history of the body, which a lot of which we don't know.
That's true. And I do suggest to them that preparation of study skins and their understanding of anatomy when they're doing that in the lab goes hand in hand with an understanding that they may take away from the course. So I obviously still include that with my courses, and I know that it is being dropped in many programs. But.
Excellent.
Bob,
Go ahead.
I don't know how many responses included classes of 100 or larger, but the one example that I know that comes to mind is a large state land grant university, and their wildlife majors are required to take mammalogy. It's offered every fall, and the class is somewhere between 100 and 200, split up into lab sections. So I'm wondering if that's what's behind some of these large classes, because as far as I know, wildlife biology is the only major that at least sometimes requires mammalogy. So that's a huge part of the input for students in mammalogy, wildlife majors.
Yeah, the question was concerning wildlife majors having it as a requirement. And I did ask that question on the survey, whether your mammalogy class was a requirement. And then I tried to track that back to what department, and in fact I asked what department, and you're right, many of them, or most of them were in natural resources or wildlife departments. But that could account for, there was only 2 responses that had classes over 100. But that's interesting that in those classes, if they drop those labs down to smaller size and they can still get them out into the field, that achieves that purpose.